up on Outlook, world affairs. How well versed are you really in the knowledge of global events? Well, a recent BBC survey indicated a profound level of ignorance about world affairs, driven in large part by fear and ignorance. We're going to explore some of the fallacies and work toward greater understanding of our global self as we welcome to the program Dr. David Keeling, who's visited to date 183 countries. Outlook is next. Stay with us. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're glad you're here. So a major BBC World Service poll exploring how people in 33 countries view various countries unearthed some interesting findings, as you might think. Sadly, though, it reveals that perception rather than cold, hard facts often drives many of our opinions. We're going to talk about that, some of those misconceptions. We're going to talk about ISIS and so much more as we welcome to the program Dr. David Keeling. He's with WKU's Geography and Geology Department, a globe trekker is what we call you. So as we mentioned in the introduction, you've been thus far to date 183 countries.
It's been a long, strange trip. And if you remember that line from Indiana Jones, it's not the years, honey, it's the miles.
And miles you have. Now, they consider you an expert in geopolitics. For our audience, help us understand what we mean when we say geopolitics.
Geopolitics is where geographers look at the relationship between a geographic space, a country, a territory, and people and resources. Most conflicts or challenges that political states have are about territory and resources. Embedded in that notion of geopolitics then are issues like political structures and anthropological structures, linguistic structures, etc. But it's the territory, the geography that drives the analysis. That's geopolitics in a nutshell.
So when we talk about these findings, the BBC findings, you know, we always say in the media, and sometimes we are blamed, perceived reality. Who cares if it's not reality? As long as the perception is there, it can become reality in many people's minds. You hear about these surveys driven by fear. People don't want to know, they don't want to be affected by it, and just plain ignorance.
I think part of the challenge is the way that societies promote their own national self-interest, and how in the modern world there's so much information out there that we tend to gravitate towards that which makes us less fearful or helps us to be more comfortable. And that BBC survey builds on many other surveys that show, unfortunately for the United States, that Americans are the most ignorant in the developed world when it comes to understanding the world around us. And that has huge implications for foreign policy. Less than half of all Americans have a passport. We have maybe 3 to 4% of all American students go on to study abroad. You know, even with our best efforts, we still have a very, very low participation rate. So we don't know much about what goes on around the world. And a lot of the information that young people get today, or people in general, comes from talking heads that they might be comfortable with listening to, or from standard news sources. There aren't a lot of people that will read Christian Science Monitor, or Al Jazeera, or even the BBC to get a sort of a more nuanced viewpoint.
You know, as it relates to that survey that we referenced by the BBC, stereotypes can be a very dangerous thing as well. Stephen Cole, who's director of the Program on International Policy Attitude, comments, it appears that world public opinion doesn't look kindly on governments engaging in suspicious nuclear activities, as in the case of Iran, becoming more authoritarian, as in the case of China and Russia, frustrating the needs of their immigrants, as in the case of France, or occupying another country without international approval, as in the case of the U.S. But on the other hand, countries and regions that engage the world primarily through soft forms of power, like Japan and Europe, tend to get good marks. So that kind of reinforces what you just said.
It reinforces it, and there's actually good news on the democratic front. If you think about relationships between states, the geopolitics of those relationships, no democratic state since the mid-19th century has fought a war with another democratic state. Now, there's been lots of wars fought, but typically between non-democratic states or democratic states and dictatorships, etc. So there is something to be said for how societies structure themselves in those global relationships and the use of soft power rather than hard power. And most of the evidence suggests that soft power is focused more on resolving longer term issues, where hard power tries to resolve short term issues and rarely works out well.
Rarely works out well, as what we're facing right now with the situation with ISIS. If you would help our audience understand what we're talking about when we talk about ISIS.
ISIS is a group of rebels that originated out of the sort of the Syria-Iraq crisis. They're an amalgamation of something like 18 to 25 different groups with all sorts of names. Al-Nusra is one, Al-Qaeda affiliates. They're called Daesh, which is sort of an agglomeration of all these different groups. Some call them IL or IS or ISIS, all different varieties. Their goal is to create a new political state out of the ashes of Iraq and Syria. And part of the challenge in the United States is to figure out why, what that means, what our interests are, and how you best approach a challenge like ISIS in terms of our own national security.
But I mean, this is nothing new in large part, because it just seems like we keep creating our own enemies. I mean, we train a lot of those people who are a part of ISIS are people that got training from America.
Certainly, and one of the arguments that's made by critics of U.S. foreign policy is that ISIS really got started when the Syrian rebels who were pushing back against the al-Bashar government, the United States said, well, what's in our best interest here? We want to destabilize Syria so we get rid of a dictator, similar to Iraq. And so we'll support the rebels and start arming them without really understanding the geopolitical motivations of that part of the world and understanding the bigger sets of relationships, Shia and Sunni, Wahhabism and Sufism, all of these different pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that drive geopolitical motivations in that part of the world. And it's unfortunate that even though we have some very brilliant minds in our government that can form foreign policy, there's a profound level of spatial or geographic ignorance when it comes to understanding people on the ground. In a meeting a few years ago with General Petraeus, before his unfortunate downfall, he said that the United States is really good about understanding physical geography. You know, we can put tanks in the desert, we can fly helicopters all over the mountains, do that. But when it comes to cultural geography, human geography, understanding the geopolitics of a place, we don't do that very well at all. And part of the strategy back in Iraq was, let's get some anthropologists and send them in there and try and understand what goes on in these communities. And it didn't work because that was too narrow a focus for a bigger set of spatial or geographical issues. And so we continue to struggle in the United States to understand what the motivations are of ISIS, what the end game is for geopolitical struggles in this region, and whether or not we should put boots on the ground again. And that's where the United States population is sort of caught between their left or right-wing or center-wing ideologies and motivated by, in sometimes fear, sometimes ignorance.
The end game, as it were, with this, I mean, it almost appears to be destruction. Just destroy. Get in there and destroy.
The challenge is that Iraq is a failed state, and nobody's willing to really understand how and why. These territories were created at the end of the 19th century with the breakup of the British and French colonial empires, and we created all of these political boundaries encompassing groups of people that naturally have been enemies for millennia. And now we're trying to create a national political identity out of an Iraq made up of multiple groups, out of a Syria made up of multiple groups, and it just isn't working because those countries don't have the types of values and opportunities that we had when the United States was created as an immigrant country. Sea to shining sea, manifest destiny,
Yes.
all of those types of things. There's 5,000 years of cultural history and geography in the Middle East that we don't understand very well.
Well, and they don't understand us very well either. According to this BBC survey of 33 countries, which indicates, you know, the U.S. is always there toward the bottom. Is that jealousy? Is that misunderstanding as well? Is that ignorance?
You know, it's all of those things. What's fascinating about traveling in those parts of the world is that whether you're in Iraq or Iran or Saudi Arabia, people admire Americans. People love to talk to Americans because they admire who we are and what we're capable of doing. What they despise oftentimes is our meddling, our politics. And if you can separate the two, you can have some really interesting conversations. So you talk to, I'm sure, people in ISIS or people in Boko Haram or any of these groups, they despise American politics. Some may say, well, but they also hate Americans as a society. I don't believe that's true. I think they aspire to achieve what we've achieved, but in a different way, not under our frame of reference, but under their own cultural frame of reference. And we've yet to figure that out, the political solution to those problems.
Communication? Education?
Well, certainly communication. I mean, look at the disastrous level of language acquisition in the United States over the last decade or so. You know, language acquisition, even Spanish, has dropped something like 8.99% over the last decade. And these are the people that live amongst us that speak that language. And so we just have really failed to come to grips with this integrated, globalized, interconnected world. And so we rely on fear and innuendo and speculation because we just don't understand. And understanding really takes work. I mean, you've got to invest some time and energy to understand what's going on.
To be determined. We're going to talk some more about geopolitics and lots of interesting world notions when we come back on Outlook with Dr. David Keeling. Stay with us, won't you? Outlook continues. I'm Barbara Deeb. On the program today, we're talking with Dr. David Keeling about geopolitics and really asking you, how well versed are you really in your world ideas, in your world scope? We're talking about that. Now, before the break, we referenced a BBC, and that's what kind of got this all going. There was a BBC World Service poll exploring how people in 33 countries view various countries. And basically, it's fear and ignorance. We don't know a lot about other countries, so we rely on those two things to kind of help us get through. You were talking about the importance of communication and education to open those doors. And you referenced, and this is a good point, our ability to acquire another language has gone down tremendously over the last few years. Is there hope for that?
Well, I think the challenge there is that we've always taught languages in high schools and universities in sort of a more academic sense rather than a pragmatic sense. And I really don't mean dumbing down, but really helping students to communicate one-on-one in a general cultural situation. And we've not done a very good job with that. And you could apply that thinking to lots of different academic subjects.
Sure.
Part of the challenge is helping individuals to understand what the threats and risks are. And I think if you went out into our own community in South Central Kentucky and asked people about ISIS, a lot of people think that, you know, they're going to be murdered in their beds. ISIS is going to come through the back door. And that's just nonsense. And it's because of fear and ignorance. They just don't understand where all of these issues fit in their broader global context because their focus is so narrow.
Broadening that focus through programs like this, through general education, is a first step.
It's an important step because you know you have to try and contextualize risk. If you're worried about risk, you know, think about how many gun deaths do we have in the United States in a given year? How many people die from floods and tornadoes? You know, disastrous situation in Houston and Texas area today with bad weather. And then you think about, well, what's the potential for deaths from ISIS in the United States? And it's just understanding managing risk. And I would encourage people, if you see a Saudi student, for example, on campus, stop and have a conversation. Because they're wonderful people, they come from a different culture, a different perspective, and ask them how they see us. And it's a very, very revealing conversation. Because there are stereotypes on all sides.
Oh, of course. It works
Works
two-way
both ways.
street. That's right.
Absolutely.
You talk about risk, and tomorrow, as we speak, and we're recording this program, you're heading off to Chile
Correct.
to take some students on do we still call them exchange programs?
Study abroad programs.
Study abroad.
Yeah.
Study abroad.
Yeah.
And you were commenting on the fact that it's important to know the culture that you're visiting, to do the homework and to not make those little mistakes that might turn into a major tragedy.
Exactly, because wherever you might go, whether it's Japan or a country in Europe or South America, you have to be aware of sort of cultural norms and what issues you might find yourself confronting or situations. Chile, for example, is a conservative Catholic country. And so that doesn't mean that you suddenly have to change who you are and how you act, but you have to be sensitive to particular types of values in society. Chileans dress very conservatively when they're going out to dinner or to work. Walking around in sort of ratty jeans and t-shirt probably won't send a message that you're, there to learn about society and engage in the culture. And so there are little nuances in any society that you need to pick up on to try and fit in. Because the last thing we want students to do is stand out as the ignorant, uninformed, ugly American. Mm-hmm. We really want students to engage and absorb and meld into the culture. We call it place as text is one way of describing that, where we really want to help students learn to read the culture through interaction, through engagement.
And the study abroad program has grown over the past several years. And is there a particular region of the country where more universities from the United States are attempting to send their students, or does that just happen along the way?
I think it's more by luck than good judgment. That's part of the data set that I've been looking at about study abroad programs in general over the last decade. They've been flat. Somewhere in the low 3 to 4% of all Americans travel overseas. And of course, our own mission at Western Kentucky University is internationalization, and we've tried very, very hard to build that up. This year we'll probably have, 400 and something students going overseas out of a population of 21,000. That's low and that's bad. Mm-hmm. And there has to be a way, whether it's through federal or state or private support, to educate more Americans by putting them in those cultural contexts where they can really think outside of their own cultural boundaries. And so, I'm a big promoter in getting students overseas anywhere, anytime, anyway, anyhow, because it's the best education you'll ever have.
No, I have to agree with that, and I think everyone should step outside the country and take a look in and do, as you say, see how others view us. And maybe you don't have that opportunity to travel abroad, but you could, as you say, encounter someone from another country and maybe have a conversation.
Sure. Internationalization is right here on campus. We've got students from 30, 40 different countries right here on campus.
In the city, and they participate in many activities around the city, around the county.
Yep.
If you were to, as a do we call you a geopolitician?
Geopolitician.
Or
just a geographer is fine.
A geographer. But as you look around, you're visiting Chile, you're looking at ISIS, what kind of threat that is. Where is our biggest threat? The United States. Are we still looking to the Middle East, or are there, meanwhile, other things are brewing?
Our biggest threat, I think, is ourselves. If you think about the long-term future of this nation, we've fallen down all of the main development rankings, healthcare, education, technology, our road and rail and airport infrastructure is crumbling. Those are the threats to our society. They're internal in nature. But if you were to think about the world as a chessboard, probably the two biggest counterweights to the US are Russia and China. I would be more concerned about Russia than anybody in the Middle East. That's internecine fighting in the Middle East. They'll figure themselves out. I just let ISIS get on with it and let the people in the Middle East deal with it. No more Americans on the ground in those countries. Deal with other issues such as what's happening in Russia with Putin, what's happening in China, and those relationships that are changing the US's power to influence the global system.
Very important. You talked about, technology is something that you just referenced. As we look ahead and in this new era, the way in which we do some of these things, technology has certainly changed that, but it also creates a threat in and of itself as well.
Of course.
Cyber terrorism.
Yep.
And so we have to view this with different eyes, or is it your opinion that in the end it comes down to some very basic fundamentals?
A lot of it is very basic fundamentals, is understanding what you've got and how you best manage it, and understanding what motivations are. You know, a great example, I was reading an article this morning about the Chinese are investing in South America. They want to build a high-speed railroad from Brazil across the Andes Mountains to Peru to create a bioceanic corridor. Well, why isn't the United States doing things like that? Why are outside countries, outside powers, outside the Western Hemisphere getting interested in these particular opportunities? And I think we're missing a lot of potential groundbreaking relationship building with people in our own hemisphere or our traditional allies by being sidetracked by all these other geopolitical challenges. Focus on infrastructure, focus on building technology and capabilities.
Well, yes, but on the one hand, those have to be dealt with. So you think just too much focus in that regard?
I think we've wasted a lot of something like $1.7 trillion in American treasure in the Middle East over the last decade, and it really hasn't done anything. Iraq is no more stable today than it was in 2003, and I think we get easily distracted by fear and ignorance, by not really understanding how these relationships work and really understanding what is it that motivates Iraqis as a group of Kurds, Shias, and Sunnis, along with all the other bits and pieces, and what makes a nationalistic Iraqi country. And we just haven't figured that out.
You know, get back to the technology thing. You know, we see these science fiction movies where, you know, they invade our infrastructure through, you know, with cyber crimes, our grids are off, you know. You think that could happen?
You know, it's possible. I mean, you think about The Matrix and some of those films that have played on those cyber technology fears. There are some very bright people out there that can do a lot of damage in the existing infrastructure we have. The problem for the United States is that our overall infrastructure is in very, very bad shape. Our electricity grid is incredibly vulnerable, not only to natural things like solar flares, but terrorist activities will just collapse. You know, our road systems, our telecommunication systems, we really haven't invested anything in infrastructure in 30 years as a society. We've got individuals doing that, the Bill Gates and the Steve Jobs of this world doing a great job, but as a society, we've not invested in anything. So we become vulnerable through poor investment or inactivity.
That having been said, you also at the beginning of the show talked about how less than half of Americans have a passport?
Correct.
And is that because they don't get one unless they think they're going to travel?
I think it's just that mindset that, you know, why go elsewhere? We have everything here in the United States, which to some degree is true. We got a vast, incredibly diverse country. But if you look at most European Union countries, you know, it's up 75, 80%. Even a lot of African countries and Asian countries, it's higher percentage of passport holders than in the United States for different reasons, for economic reasons, political reasons. You know, Americans just don't travel as much as other societies. The Chinese are really going to take off, literally and figuratively, in the next decade or so, because you've got 350 million middle-class Chinese now that are aching to see the rest of the world. 350 million, that's more than the population of the United States.
That's a lot of people.
They've all got passports.
Chile, where you head off tomorrow for your study abroad. You were mentioning to me before the interview how Chileans have many of the same issues we do. And one in particular are student protests. They have students who are protesting. And what they're protesting is, guess what? The high cost of education.
Yes.
And that's something that you will take these students from Western Kentucky University and expose them to?
Yes, we're going to spend time in Valparaiso, which is where the protests are happening this past weekend and probably next weekend as well. But try and talk to some colleagues in the universities there and understand the structure. The education system in South America generally has always been free to most people, except for the private universities. State universities being free, but they've had a curriculum that's sort of very focused on what the government wants you to learn. And so because of all of their financial problems, they're trying to raise tuition. And students that are used to free tuition, Don't
Not
like that
happy.
one little bit. Not happy at all.
Do we blame them? Do we blame them? Dr. David Keeling, you're always so enlightening. So you've been to 183 countries so far.
So far.
Where would you like to go next?
North Korea, definitely. It's on my bucket list. And next year I'm going to Tuvalu in the South Pacific on one of my expeditions, and that'll be a first time for me.
Tuvalu is?
Tuvalu is a small Pacific island in the Southwest Pacific. The island that got devastated by that massive cyclone last year. And so that'll be very interesting to see what's going on there. And there are lots of little islands scattered around that I have not got to yet. Yet to see.
And it's fun to say Tuvalu.
Tuvalu.
Have safe travels. And thank you for enlightening us.
Thank you, Barbara.
That's going to wrap it up for this week's edition of Outlook. I hope you learned a little something about geopolitics and the world around you. Until next time, I'm Barbara Deep. Thanks.